So as if on cue. So we are recording the event and we will share this afterwards as well. So you'll be able to pass it on to any colleagues or watch back your favorite bits if you'd like to. And then what makes always these events, I think, we're all getting a little bit more practiced at virtual events now. What always makes them much more interesting, much more successful, in my opinion, is when we get lots of engagement questions from yourselves. And we've left lots of time at the end for a Q&A. And again, if you go to the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button where you can add your questions. And at the end, we'll be bringing all of our speakers, panelists together, and we'll be able to ask them any follow-up questions that you might have, either from their research or any of the comments and things that you hear this morning. So much more important is that you hear from our speakers today. So I am delighted to welcome and introduce Katie Freeman, our Research and Insight Manager from Magic Breakfast.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I will just give Matthew a moment to bring up my slides. So today I'm going to be talking through some recent research that we did with children, young people, parents and caregivers. And this research has gone live on our website this morning. So today I'll be sharing with you a selection of findings from this research. However, these findings, you can see more of these in more detail up on our website. And obviously feel free to reach out to me if we aren't able to answer any of your questions at the end today. So moving on to the next slide, this research was conducted in September to December 2022 in Magic Breakfast partner schools. And it's important to note that this research was done in schools that have existing breakfast provision and are located in areas of high disadvantage, which means the findings aren't representative of all schools in England and Scotland. This research collected both quantitative and qualitative data, qualitative data via surveys and focus groups with pupils, and also surveys and interviews with parents. We had a great response from a really diverse group, which allows us to understand the perspectives from a wide range of localities, age groups, household types, for example. And while there are many reasons why we did this research, a key driver was to ensure that children and young people and parents' needs and opinions are communicated to policymakers where relevant. And I think why this is needed is best summed up by a group of pupils in one of our partner schools who said, it's important that policy that directly impacts us reflects our experiences, views, and feelings. And sadly, while this makes logical sense, this isn't always the case, with one focus group stating many of us were surprised to be included in this research. We also did this research because it's both an both an advocacy and service delivery organisation. We also wanted to ensure that we can improve our own program to benefit more children and young people and families, and share our learnings with the sector to enhance other programs. For example, we know that there are certain groups we aren't reaching or who might not engage with school breakfast provision, despite the fact that they are at risk of morning hunger. And this research has helped us to identify these groups and understand a little bit more about why they aren't engaging, which is key for us to improve our services. So moving on to some of the findings. As some of you will know, the current government has announced funding for wraparound childcare and is currently funding the National School Breakfast Programme for over 2,500 schools in England. Last year, the Labour Party committed to rolling out breakfast clubs in primary schools should they be elected, and a similar commitment has been made by the current Scottish Government. And what's great to see from the research in this context is that these policies have really strong support from children and young people, especially the food element, with 4 in 5 children and young people agreeing that it's important to offer children something to eat for breakfast at school. And similarly, parents, on the next slide, we can see that 9 in 10 parents agree that every child should have access to a healthy breakfast at the start of the school day. Let me click onto the next one, thank you. And then one more over. Wonderful. And when we examine families' morning routines, it's perhaps not surprising why this is the case. Children and parents alike identified that breakfast time is often rushed and it's a time with lots of competing priorities and is rarely a sit-down meal for many families. Common challenges that were mentioned included getting to work on time, children being fussy or picky eaters, and also young people highlighted that they will often prefer to stay in bed than get up and have breakfast, which often led to them rushing in the morning. We also found from the research that these challenges change based on the household circumstances. For example, and not unsurprisingly, the larger the family, the more children in that household, the more challenges and barriers around breakfast time they experienced. We also heard from families where someone in the household had a disability that this often meant that they had to choose between arriving at school on time or having breakfast at home. So what this highlights to us is that there are a multitude of reasons why children and young people start the day without breakfast, which is perhaps why such universal policies around school food are supported by so many children, young people, and families. And moving on to the next slide, thank you. In the context of chaotic mornings, it's perhaps not surprising then that so many families do engage with school breakfast provision, with this research finding that only 22% of parents surveyed say they never make use of school breakfast. We did find from the research that some families engage with school breakfast provision more regularly than others, including larger families and low-income households, which chimes with sector data that these families are more vulnerable and more at risk of food insecurity. The research also found that the reasons why families use breakfast provision are varied, with some being driven by what children would like and others because of household circumstances, such as 14% stating that it was because it reduces pressure on the family budget. As part of this research, we also asked children and young people why they have breakfast at school for their thoughts on their school breakfast provision. And it was great to see so many positive impacts of school breakfast provision for children and young people. One of my favourites on this slide is that 56% of children and young people said that having breakfast at school made them like school more. And then if we move on to the next slide, we also saw lots of benefits described in children and young people's own words. So children commented on the importance of being able to check in with friends before school. Lots of secondary pupils said that they used their school breakfast provision as the chance to catch up on homework. Many children mentioned that it was an opportunity to check in with staff, talk about their concerns or worries for the school day. And some pupils were able to take on additional tasks and responsibilities, such as becoming breakfast monitors who might give out bagels to their peers or help set up or break down their breakfast provision. And some pupils said that they found this motivating. And pupils that attended Breakfast Club generally talked about how they also found it a calmer and more relaxed way to start the day. And we see that this broad range of impacts for children and positive outcomes that they described were also described by parents, with parents noting that breakfast provision at school supports calmer morning routines and could even be an incentive to get their child to school on time. Like children, they commented on the positives of socialising and also developing independence, such as through those breakfast monitor roles I mentioned. But what I think is most significant on this slide and this aspect of the research was the strong rhetoric that families mentioned around how breakfast provision was there if there was an unexpected change to their circumstances. And I think the reason why this came through so strongly in the research was given when this research was done. It was done in winter, and just as we were going into winter, and as the cost of living crisis was beginning to bite. And at Magic Breakfast, we're really proud that our provision is there for anyone that needs it. It's not means tested, and if someone does have a change to their household circumstances, they're able to access breakfast in the morning without barrier or stigma. And I think this approach seemed to be significant for parents and perhaps is a learning not just for breakfast policy, but also other policies where stigma might be a barrier to engagement. There were lots of questions raised from the research, and one that stood out to Magic Breakfast was the drop-off not only in the number of children and young people eating breakfast, but also engaging with school breakfast provision at secondary level. And when we pair this with the qualitative data, we're able to build a picture of why some young people don't eat breakfast or engage with provision. And so what the next steps are for Magic Breakfast is we're going to be working with children and young people and families to trial solutions to overcome some of the barriers identified. We also asked about the cost of living crisis given when this research was done, and not unsurprisingly, families in our partner schools are being acutely impacted by the cost of living crisis. Often in situations like this, food is the first household expense to be impacted, as it's elastic, it's something that families can control. And you can see that in these statistics here, with 33% saying they've had to cut back on the amount of food they buy, and 18% of parents saying they're skipping meals so their child can eat. From the research, we also found that this is impacting some households more than others. So, for example, low income and larger households were being more impacted, and this chimes with sector data on the cost of living crisis as well. Sadly, we also found from the research that a fifth of children worry about not having enough food at home. And we know that worry about food insecurity can have long-term repercussions for children. And before I finish up today, I just wanted to share this story, as this session is all about the voices of children and young people and families. And obviously every child and family is unique, but we are able to pick out common themes from the research. And one that came through really strongly was the role that children often play in caring for their siblings, which is why I've chosen to share this story today. I'm just going to pause for a moment and let you read this. Wonderful. And so what is next for this research? Well, if we move on to the next slide, we can see that we're going to build in regular collection of children, young people and parents' voices into our program delivery. And we'd love to hear from other organisations how you've done this successfully. And I'm also happy to share our plans and learnings along the way. We're going to use these findings to enhance our service delivery. So, for example, we asked a lot of questions around the types of food children enjoy eating for breakfast, the variety that they have in their diets, and we'll be using these to shape our breakfast offering in the future. We're also going to build upon these findings with further research and integrate these voices into our policy and advocacy work. And this will be done in a range of ways, but most importantly, is being shaped through conversations with children and young people and parents and caregivers who engage with the research. This research is now live on our website, and while we'll absolutely have the chance for questions at the end, if you do have any follow-up questions or want to deep dive into a particular area of the research, do reach out to myself or anyone else at Magic Breakfast, and I will pass back to Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Katie. And as Katie highlighted, I think the key for us, and recognizing, as she touched on, the current discussion and commitment to wraparound childcare, we see that opportunity for Magic Breakfast and others to come together and ensure that really high quality and child-centered support provision and opportunity to further educate and enrich their school day. So we are now going to hear a little bit more about the school day, the extended school day, from Sabrina Hummel. She is senior researcher at the Centre for Social Justice. And I was looking this morning at CSJ's vision, which is for those living in the poorest and most disadvantaged communities across Britain to be given every opportunity to flourish and reach their full potential. And I think for us at Magic Breakfast, that is absolutely what we hope we're able to fuel with a healthy start to the day. And we are delighted to welcome you, Sabrina, and hear a little bit more about your research as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was a very lovely introduction. I'm just going to wait until the slides are fab. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. As Lindsay says, I'm from the Centre for Social Justice, and it's my pleasure to talk to you today about our enrichment guarantee. So if we could go on to the first slide, please. I thought that I would begin by setting kind of the national challenges that the most disadvantaged young people face kind of in context. And to do this, I'm going to pull from two of our recent reports, one of which was published back in kind of 2021 and the other which came out in March of this year. But both basically make the case that we want to be improving outcomes for the most disadvantaged young people through enrichment. And I'll kind of talk you through that in a minute. But starting with, we go to the next slide, please. The biggest national challenges we see it at the minute for young people is this whole discussion around severe absence and the ghost children of the pandemic. So these are the children who are absent from school more frequently than they attend. They're the ones that struggle to get back into school after the pandemic ended, and the ones that we're most kind of concerned about. They've been called the ghost children, and quite rightly, and the CSJ has done a lot of work to kind of put this on the agenda. We released our severe absence tracker yesterday, so check it out. It's very enlightening and also slightly terrifying. But yeah, so severe absence is kind of a growing problem. In the autumn of 2019, so pre-pandemic, we had about 60,244 children that were out of school more frequently than they were attending class. And this number shot up to 125,222 children in the autumn of 2022. So that's an increase of 108% on pre-pandemic levels. So this cohort of children that aren't attending is growing rapidly. And it might not come as a surprise to learn that it's those children that kind of face additional barriers that have the greatest rates of severe absence. So children who are eligible for free school meals, their severe absence rate is triple that of those who are not eligible, so 3% versus 0.9%, and those statistics refer to the academic year 2021-2022. And so we could go on to the next slide, please. I just then thought it'd be helpful to kind of chat through the other challenges that young people face, and this is drawing on our level playing field report. And none of these will be unfamiliar, but nevertheless helpful to kind of set the conversation we're having about getting children kind of into school, accessing breakfast provision, accessing enrichment into context. So the attainment gap, progress in closing that has basically been wiped out since the pandemic began, which means that all of those great gains have stalled, and the gap between kind of the better off children and those that are more disadvantaged is widening. We're seeing a spiraling mental health crisis. In 2022, 1 in 6 children aged 5 to 17 had a probable mental disorder, and that's up from 1 in 9 in 2017, so a big increase. Obesity and childhood inactivity is a problem. You've got about 1 in 5 young people aged 17 that's obese, and at primary school, you've got 1 in 3 children who are overweight or obese. Children just aren't moving as frequently as they used to now. Activity levels have more or less recovered to pre-pandemic levels, but that gain was slower for children from the least affluent backgrounds. And in terms of crime, CSJ has done some polling here, and almost half of parents report that their children have been victims of antisocial behaviour at any point. And finally, the skills gap. Children aren't leaving school kind of prepared and ready for the world of work. A 2019 survey by CBI found that half of 17 to 23-year-olds just don't feel prepared for the workforce. And so with all of that said, what are we going to do about it? What do we propose might help temper some of those challenges? And that's what I will hopefully talk you through on the next slide. So our big idea is an enrichment guarantee. And this basically says that every child should be entitled to 5 hours of extracurricular activity every week, be that kind of in the morning before school starts or in the afternoon. We think this should be mandatory because when it's been done and trialed before, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, it's often those children that are furthest behind, that are more disadvantaged, that are less likely to take up that offer. So we feel that a mandatory element would help offset that challenge around engagement for the most disadvantaged, those children that really would benefit the most from accessing this enrichment. We think it should be delivered by the community and voluntary sector. This is not about more teacher time or more classroom learning. This is really about things like art and music and drama and breakfast clubs, and all of the stuff that just supports kind of a child's holistic development. We think government should appoint a stream of providers to help prime the market so that you know what you're getting, create a digital database of here's who's available, here's what they're rated, a place to give feedback so that people and teachers particularly kind of know who they're commissioning. Obviously, this takes time to roll out, and so we're suggesting it be rolled out in phases, maybe starting in areas that have kind of the highest proportion of children on free school meals, or using kind of other indices of deprivation. And finally, the government would need to change the law so that schools would have a legal duty to meet the demand flowing from a new requirement. I was really shocked to learn from our polling, which we conducted for our level playing field report, that at present 1 in 5 children do no enrichment activities in a week, and this unsurprisingly rises to 1 in 4 for children in the most disadvantaged areas. So why do we think that this has legs? Why do we think it would work? Well, it's sort of been trialled before under the previous Labour government. So they called it their Extended Services in Schools programme, and it ran between 2003 and 2010. They had a big evaluation of 1,500 schools, and they had some really promising results. They found that 71% of those schools reported that it helped them to engage disadvantaged families, which is, I suppose, what we're all here for and what we all want to see happen. 69% reported that there was some impact on raising attainment. More than half saw a reduction in the number of behaviour incidents. 45% saw an increase in attendance, so children were getting back into the classrooms and attending more frequently. And there was a reduction of 31% in school exclusions. And there's support for this measure. So again, we went out to ask parents what they thought about this. And about 51% of parents do support a time requirement for their children to do enrichment activities outside of ordinary school hours. And of those parents that supported that time requirement, the majority said an hour is about right. So that's why we've gone with 5 hours, an hour a week, or sorry, an hour a day even. And yeah, if we could just pop to the next slide. This slide is just intended to kind of bring some of this together, and I suppose get into some of the weeds again of why we think this would be a successful or a good idea potentially. So I suppose the first place to start is, as Katie kind of really powerfully just spoke about, the cost of living crisis is biting, and putting on breakfast clubs and providing meals is a really important part of potentially a broader package of support to help families with the challenges that they're facing right now. And also to address some of the challenges that I talked about on the previous slide. As I mentioned, that evaluation under Labour did find that that disengagement piece was tempered, so they saw more families, more disadvantaged families engaging with school when they put on all of these additional services than they had been before that. The EEF research supports the idea that extended school time boosts academic progress, so helping to kind of narrow down that attainment gap. We know that children who, say, for example, are taking part in sport or physical activity are likely to feel better in their cells mentally and physically, so that again, kind of addressing that mental health crisis element, that obesity problem, that inactivity problem. And sort of my personal favourite, I suppose, only because I'm currently doing a bit of research into crime and youth offending, but after school is really dangerous, the 4 to 6 p.m. window. And so if we were to kind of keep children kind of behind the school gates for longer, then that might go some way to address the risks that they face between 4 and 6 p.m. when they're actually most likely to be victims of stabbings. And finally, again, something that Katie talked about just now, that children, when they come in before school or they stay after school and they potentially get fed and they sit around the table, they get a chance to kind of build a lot of those soft life skills that that CBI survey told us young people don't feel that they have when they leave school. So things like, I think Katie said, breakfast monitors, taking on additional responsibilities, having that time to check in with teachers, building all of that soft stuff that we know is so important for success after school. And I'm just going to finish with a couple of more thoughts, which are, well, yeah, almost. I would just wanted to let everyone know that, the CSJ has been launching, we launched an inquiry into absence, or rather we put in our own submission to the government's absence inquiry, and the value of breakfast clubs came through really strongly. Participants were really passionate about the importance of you're going to have children in early, like you must make sure that they're fed, that they've had a healthy meal. And it was actually more often than not sports charities that told us about this. I was really shocked to hear in the course of my research that now more than ever, parents are keeping their children off kind of sport and extracurricular activities because they're afraid that they'll be burning all of these extra calories and they won't be able to feed them more food as a result, so they're keeping them off. So there's something really powerful about if children are taking part in all of this wider enrichment stuff, be it before or after school, that there is a kind of food component to it. And as Lindsay just said, the kind of government's commitment to kind of wrap around childcare is another really important piece I think we all need to be thinking about. You know, childminding is important and providing parents with that extra support, you know, between 8 and 6 so that they can work and not have to rush back, but also thinking about how do we think really creatively about using that time for more than just childminding. How do we make sure that children have, that they're fed, that they get the nutritious food that they need to flourish, that they have access to sport and physical activity and music, and kind of, or even how they meeting kind of local place-based challenges between the hours of before and after school. So just leaving you with that thought and just saying thanks for having me, and that's it. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to have a slide for any questions, so happy to kind of leave that to the official Q&A bit.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. And I think what really struck me when you were talking through things is, you know, the, I suppose, severity and the scale of some of those national challenges sound really daunting, and the solutions in some respects almost sound and feel quite simple. But I suppose that's often the case, isn't it, with policy, in terms of the kind of simple solutions, tried and tested, are the ones that have that really, you know, greatest level of impact. But I think always a bit risky for us to talk about and think about policy without thinking about the practical implications of that. So I'd ask our other panelists, Julie Harkness, if possible, to come on screen, and we're going to have our Q&A. I would welcome and encourage attendees to drop your questions into the Q&A section, but I just wanted to welcome Julie. So Julie is Vice Principal of Carr Manor Community School and All Through School in Leeds, and she is also a wonderful and very appreciated trustee here at Magic Breakfast. She joined nearly a year ago now. And Julie, I'm really interested to hear, as a school leader, your reflections on what you've heard, and I suppose, what do you see and what do you feel is the need for this education policy that can support children before and after school? And what benefits do you maybe see already in your school, but also what challenges do you foresee from your school and context?
Okay, thank you. I think I will talk from my context in particular, if that's okay. So Carr Manor Community School is a through school where we meet the needs of children from 4 to 16 as a minimum, sometimes 17. It's in an area in Leeds where there are 66 languages spoken in school. Our free school meal rate is about 35%, and that doesn't count the group of children that we worry about as a school, who are the children who is not a high income, but nor are those families entitled to any kind of benefit to support that income. So there is such a hidden group of children that are really quite deprived, particularly in the cost of living crisis, in terms of whether they get a meal that isn't actually provided by school. So we have a number of things that would support engagement with children. Luckily, I'm old enough to remember the extended services offered from 2003 to 2010 and the difference that made. And I think if I can begin with the benefits. So in terms of our children, we have our children from 4 all the way to 16 have access to a magic breakfast each morning if they want one. And that has made a huge difference to our children, particularly where families are not able to provide a breakfast, are not often organised enough to be able to manage that and work and get children to school, particularly where there are distinct increasing pressures that we've seen around food poverty. In terms of those children whose parents wouldn't be able to work successfully unless there was an element of childcare, particularly for the younger children, by being able to access a breakfast club. We've noticed a particular difference that it's made to attendance across the piece. whether that's our younger children or our older children. So I think a very specific example of that I would give as a very mini sentence or so long case study would be that we have a child in year 2 whose mother suffers from quite a distinct disability and has not been well for a very long time. His elder brother has been involved in criminality in the past, and because of the situation in which they've been living has been quite vulnerable around mum's needs and having to move houses frequently, around landlords being able to support the family and the arrangements they need in which they can live because of mum's disability. His attendance was really quite poor, and Breakfast Club has made a significant difference to what's happening in that family that was really pretty much at the risk of intervention by social care, to be able to function really quite normally, to be able to bring him to school, to have a breakfast, to start his day really, really calmly and well, which I think is a significant aspect for many of our children, that it's a really regulated start to the day. But also to be able to support the family much more generally around that health and well-being of the entire family, to reduce that what becomes quite intense pressure, I think, at the beginning of the day. In terms of an enrichment offer, I think that's huge, particularly for our older children. We're very lucky in that we reorganise well, not lucky, but we're very deliberate in the way that we organise our human resources and our staffing to enable there to be provision after school through that vulnerable period for those children that are at risk of criminality. It means that we run an offer every day for children that is anything from a space to learn, because actually they can't learn in a crowded household where there isn't a desk to sit at, there isn't a quiet room, they're probably sharing a bedroom with 2 or 3 other people. So finding that space even just to study and learn sometimes can be very difficult for some of our pupils, but also that much broader offer around health and well-being. We work with children to give them a voice in what provision they want, and I think that's a sensible way to have done. So we have high levels of engagement, our attainment's good, our exclusion rates are really low, and I don't think we can underestimate the significance of the offer that our children have pretty much from 7:45 in the morning, 7:30 in some cases, right through till, you know, certainly well after the school day finishes, be that 4, 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. The challenge is that we do restructure and reorganise the way our staff work to be able to manage this, which is an investment, quite a costly investment and a deliberate investment. But as the budgets decrease, as we are finding ourselves as all under increased pressure with fuel bills, the changes to salaries and all of those things, and whilst they're really important for our staff, our budget shrinks, and as our budget shrinks, it's really hard to maintain at the levels that we do. We commit to it because we see the overall benefit, but I think it's really, and we're a large organisation with over 200 staff, so we're able to manage it. But I think some of the challenges for other schools in looking at this is that mainly it's dependent on, can they reorganise their staffing to be there at the beginning and the end of the day when they don't have enough staff to manage what happens for the core part of education. I think in smaller schools, that will be a real pressure. I'd also note that, you know, recruitment is not straightforward in schools. We've seen the numbers of teachers going into initial teacher training drop. We've seen that actually you can earn a lot more going to work in Aldi or Lidl, not name dropping there, any other supermarket would do, but also that actually if you can earn more doing that than actually a really valuable piece of work as a TA, then that can be harder to maintain. So from a policy point of view, I think it would support schools to understand the importance and the difference that can actually make to their most vulnerable learners, to the children that are eligible for pupil premium, to the children who are potentially going to create an additional pressure on social care in particular, as well as that much broader swathe of outcomes for mental health, for obesity, for ensuring that there is a wide offer. We make good use of some of our clubs to develop leadership skills in children as well, which I think is another thing that potentially runs the risk of being lost. So applying a mandate to it would ensure that there is a permission, in a sense, to feel and to feel assured that those decisions to use resource in that way is absolutely what we should be doing. And I think there are some schools that can't engage or find it hard to engage, perhaps a very small primary school with a limited number of staff, with 7 classes perhaps, will have more difficulty. But in actual fact, there are also some schools, and perhaps multi-academy trusts, that don't engage. There are many that do, but there are some that don't engage and stick very much to what they would see as a very traditional core education that starts at 9 and then the children leave at 3 and are not their responsibility, or it's, or certainly not necessarily thinking about what their welfare might look like in those more vulnerable parts of the day. So I think, for me, an educational policy that mandates that wraparound care to ensure that our families are supported, our children get every single opportunity to level that playing field. In terms of levelling up, I think it would be an absolutely huge step, or it is a huge step to consider in those terms, and all of the benefits that there are to the longer term, health, well-being, success, the character for learning that our children will have, are really important for what our future workforce will need.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Julie. And you've actually started to answer a question that came in while you were speaking from Joe about how children who have maybe carer responsibilities themselves can, meaningfully take part in additional hours. And you've touched on it in kind of an individual family case study. And I wonder, Sabrina, did you have anything that came through in your research or conversations that shone a light on young carers and maybe some of the considerations there?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important question, such an important issue or group. I mean, I probably can't speak to what that would look like kind of on the ground, but in terms of if we're thinking from a policy perspective about rolling this out, it can't be a blunt instrument. And I think this sort of recommendation would benefit from a kind of test pilot phase where all of these sorts of things would be thrown up, for example, like Jo has kind of implied in her question, what about those with caring responsibilities? In some ways, I would say that, that's the benefit of this sort of recommendation, is that you end up throwing up these sorts of issues and then having to tackle them. So things that, might have been hidden before come into the light, and then it gives policymakers a chance to think, well, how do we be flexible with this for the groups who have additional needs? I imagine, it might start with something as simple as, okay, well, now we know this child has caring responsibilities. Maybe it's the schools that can signpost to other services to get the right support, be it kind of family support, social services, early help, kind of creating that kind of information flow and connecting families to the services that support them. And also then doing kind of one-to-one family work and support. And there are lots of schools that do a really amazing job in kind of connecting families with the services that they need. I think maybe the fullest expression in some ways of kind of this enrichment conversation and creating space before and after the school day for this stuff is kind of the family hubs idea. It's one that CSJ has kind of championed for a while, and it basically involves co-locating services in schools so that families can come and kind of access a one-stop shop. And so maybe, yeah, the enrichment guarantee starts with, let's have children do these activities, but Jo's right to point out that there are children for whom there are additional barriers, and then it becomes a conversation of, well, how do we connect you and your family, right? So it's not just about the child, you and your family, the siblings you're caring for, the parent that needs help, give to you the right services and make it as easy as possible for them. So I hope that wasn't too rambly a response.
No, that was great. And I think that's a really good point in terms of what can actually be, drawn into the light, what, can be made more visible actually by providing it. So it's not about, I suppose, putting barriers in place, but actually by creating the opportunity, you really highlight and, emphasize what the children's and young people's experiences and what's going on in those families' lives in a much more meaningful way. Thank you. We've had another question through, which, Katie, I'm going to come to you on, and this is a slight change in tack, but looking more so at breakfast, nutrition, and obviously the pressure that we've seen with the cost of living crisis. And I know some of the elements of cost of living crisis was drawn out in the research in terms of the impact that's having on families' ability to explore and experience healthy living. Since the cost of living crisis, is it harder to provide a nutritious breakfast? And drawing on the stats of about 1 in 3 children in primary school are overweight, is there enough education around healthy eating in primary schools? And for that second part of the question around healthy eating education, Julie, just to put you on high alert, I'll come to you next for your reflections and views as well, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So touching on that first half, I think from the research we did see that families are experiencing barriers around accessing enough healthy, nutritious foods, and obviously that will have an impact on families' abilities to provide a healthy breakfast. We are seeing in the media all the time that not only is inflation increasing, but food inflation particularly is extremely high. And even at Magic Breakfast as well, in our services, we're seeing those pressures. And fortunately, we have a network and that allows us to overcome some of them. But families might not necessarily have all of those levers to pull on, especially when they're doing that in consideration of other impacts like heating through winter, access to fuel to get to work, etc. So I definitely think the cost of living crisis is having an impact on families' abilities to afford enough nutritious food to start the school day, and other research in the sector is also supporting that as well. For instance, the Food Foundation has some really great statistics around that. In terms of the kind of food education element, I will just comment on that. I think the one thing to sort of keep in mind, I think absolutely that's one aspect of it, but food systems, children unfortunately are experiencing obesity, overweightness because of the broader food system in the UK. And there are lots of others barriers and challenges. Lots of families live in food deserts where they aren't able to get access to healthy and nutritious food. There might be barriers to them purchasing that food. They might have to travel a long way. So I think education is one element of it, but I think there's also a lot of value in looking at that broader system. We also know that healthier foods tend to cost more. There's an incentive to buy less healthy foods, and often families also see that the more kind of calorie rich foods are cheaper, but they might not be as nutrient dense. So I think understanding that broader food system, and some Food Foundation again have some great statistics on that, the National Food Strategy. I think there's a lot of different levers that can be pulled to address that issue, with school breakfast provision being one element of that, as it's an opportunity to get a nutritious, healthy meal into a child and a family that might not be able to do that because of the range of factors. And I'll pass to Julie.
Thank you.
Hi, yes, I think I would second a lot of that. I think in school, I think that there's an awful lot of education about what healthy eating is and healthy lifestyle. That runs through the straightforward science curriculum. It runs through our PSHE curriculum. It's something that most schools take very seriously. They do events, in most schools along the lines of, healthy eating weeks with younger children. They look at health and mental well-being with older children and encourage people and target children. So there'll be children targeted for exercise, particularly children that, I don't know, there's quite a large number of Asian girls who are anxious about exercise. So they may be a targeted group in many schools. I know that, for example, we do healthy cookery classes that try to with families and children actually at primary level and with secondary children, to help them try and understand how that can be done more cheaply. But what cannot be done is buy fruit at the same cost as some of the more some of the cheaper, high calorie, high fat, not terribly good for your food. So I think where there are large families and where there is poverty, and with the increasing amount of money that healthy food is costing, even some of the children that perhaps would have come in with a healthier packed lunch or would have a healthy snack are either not having one or are having one that is less healthy. And that's quite a difficult conversation with families where they just can't afford to do something differently. And we support that by giving fruit and so on and so forth. But actually, in terms of the overall diet of children, whatever the disconnect or a disparity really between the kind of the espouse and operant around healthy eating and food education, and what that means for reality for a family that is in either under financial pressure or is financially really struggling. And I don't think that is well supported by the way we advertise certain foods that are not particularly healthy or snack in a way to children, not schools, but generally the advertising and the media that they see neither supports that either, because you've also got that juxtaposed really with high numbers of children with mental health that affects their eating habits. So whether that is either around obesity or an eating disorder of some other kind, that also is compounded, I think, irrespective of the level of education that I think is high across most schools.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julie. And I think a really pertinent question, which has just come through from Emily, and Sabrina, I'm going to come to you for this, is, I suppose, as has been highlighted and touched on a few times, the challenges that schools in particular at the moment are facing in terms of budgets, in terms of staffing. Julie really brought that to life. In terms of your recommendations and proposal, are you suggesting that the extended services before 9 and after 3 should be delivered by teachers, by teaching staff, or can these enrichment activities be offered by others?
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely the most pertinent question, and the question we get a lot when we suggest things like enrichment and extending the school day. People get kind of worried about whether this means that we're really trying to say teachers need to do more, and let me just say that's absolutely not what we're implying here. Our thinking behind this is that schools can kind of unlock facilities, open their doors, and kind of invite the community and voluntary sector organisations in to run a lot of the delivery. Now, I'm conscious that sounds very simple, and I'm sure that as a head teacher, Julie can probably speak directly to the challenges that this poses. So we accept that there'll be a degree of kind of someone needs to unlock the door, someone needs to supervise from kind of the school staff. That kind of our vision is for people to see kind of schools as community centres and community assets, where everybody is able to come in and share that out, in a place that kind of connects children and families with the right services, be it statutory or voluntary, to kind of support them. So I was interested, Julie, what you just touched on about reorganising and redeploying staff to make this work, and I wonder whether maybe you're better placed to tell us what some of those delivery challenges are. But certainly, we've seen it done well in a number of schools, but are cognizant of the challenges. And I would just finish by saying that when we polled parents on what they want from an extended from enrichment before and after school day, it wasn't more curriculum time. It was, our children need time to play, they need time to be kids, they need time to do art or music or sport. So there's a kind of a strong demand for that, and I accept that in some measure that could be staffed by teachers if they want to, but that's absolutely not what we're suggesting. It's more that you bring in charities and community sector groups that can do it. Post-pandemic, lots of grassroots sports clubs, for example, are really struggling. That they're struggling to pay their bills, they're struggling to pay the rent on their premises, or in some cases they just don't have them anymore. And so, in some measure, kind of bringing, there's demand on the supply side there to come in and deliver this stuff somewhere like a school, which is always going to be there. That building is not going anywhere. So those are just a couple of reflections, but it'd be fascinating to hear what Julie has to say on this, if I'm able to pass that on.
I think we as a school utilise our staff well. So that's every member of staff. I think we are a relationship-based organisation, and we work very closely. One of our first value is know our children well, and we work in partnership very closely with our parents and with our community. So I think we have reorganised the way some of our support staff work to support this, and we do feel, particularly in the morning, that actually those relationships are really, really key to what helps children be able to self-regulate well throughout the day, because of that settled period with familiar people they know, whether they're 4, whether they're 7, whether they're 11, whether they're 14. So we have taken that as really key. For us, it's really important that the engagement opportunities at the end of school are free at the point of delivery. So we have used external organisations where we're on occasion, where it's a particular skill that we perhaps don't have, but in over 200 staff, actually, we are usually fortunate to be able to find something that's of the children's interest. I think that's really key, that children have a voice in that, so that children are engaged. And so the oldest children in your organisation, even if it's secondary provision, are supporting the younger children. So some of our year 11s run clubs or support running clubs for year 7s. So you're building into the community. I think there are opportunities to make strong use of the local community in terms of people that may have struggled through particularly things like COVID, but also I think family engagement is equally important in that. And I think that ties right back even to some of the conversations about those children who may be supporting the care of family at home. So it's looking, I think, at what a school does. In a sense, it sits the school very much as the hub of the community. And I think if we can move towards that point, then we enable schools to have the capacity to do some of the additional things that are after schools without creating too much pressure on staff, so that we can retain staff and develop them to ensure that our children are getting the best provision in the classroom and around, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Thank you, Julie. And I think what seems to be coming through strongly from everyone, and I would absolutely echo this from a Magic Breakfast perspective as well, it's going to take lots of people coming together around a real, shared purpose and mission to make this work. We've had some of our local authority partners, for instance, provide the funding for the staffing to then enable Magic Breakfast to support through charitable funds the breakfast provision. So I think lots of different models in, as you say, Julie, different communities, and really unlocking those communities is crucial. I'm going to just quickly come to each of our panelists because we are coming to the end of time. And on that point of making sure that everyone's voice is heard, and particularly wanting to call out children and young people's and parents as we have today. Can you just share, how do you feel that, how does your organization currently bring the voices of those who are maybe not always in the room, not always heard, to the forefront? And how do you think policymakers and decision makers can better bring those voices into their policy decisions as well? So Sabrina, if I come to you first, and then Katie and Julie.
Thank you, Lindsay. That's a great question. You're right, that's totally what we're here this morning to talk about. So I'm really passionate about the work that the CSJ does. I think we're really good at doing this. There are a number of ways that we seek to include the voices of children and young people, and margins, certainly in our policy work. In the education unit, the CSJ is a secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group on school exclusion and alternative provision. So this means that we do the secretariat function, and we're able to bring children, practitioners, people in to directly speak to parliamentarians and have their voice heard, kind of right in the the corridors of power. So that's a really powerful way for us to influence and to kind of gather a lot of rich evidence. We do survey work, which involves polling parents and children, again, to kind of get their views front and centre and make sure that we are threading that. Threading that through. We do roundtables, we invite charities in, we go on visits to our alliance groups and member organisations. So we're always out on the front lines, speaking to people and feeding that back. We're bringing those voices, those children, those people directly into the Houses of Parliament to speak to policymakers. So that's my quick whistle-stop tour.
Thank you. And we'll go to you next, Katie.
Absolutely. I'll be speedy because I'm conscious of time, but I think the thing that stands out for me, particularly as both a service delivery and advocacy organisation, is just building in regular sort of collection and networks and ways of speaking with children and young people into our program, so that we're constantly being updated from families about what are the issues they're seeing, and then we can use those voices to kind of highlight particular issues with policymakers. And I think the other element is also being driven by what those you're engaging with would like and how they would like their voices used. So an element of this for us is speaking to lots of people that engage with this work about what they would like to see and how they would like to have their voices presented, or what they would like to be part of this journey, whether that's a lived experience panel, whether that's a quote being used in a particular space. So I think there's sort of two elements there that stand out to me.
Wonderful, thank you. And last but definitely not least, Julie, I guess from your perspective, how do we best bring those voices in that are maybe not always heard, and how do we encourage policymakers to do so as well?
From a school perspective, we're clearly around pupils and around children and young people all of the time. And I think we mustn't underestimate actually the power of children's voice and agency in terms of them learning to be socially responsible adults. And without having a voice and without seeing they have some agency in their communities and for their communities in the world, we run the risk of not reinvesting, building in those communities, and actually committing to the very British values that are inculcated in what is run through the thread of what schools are expected to engage in. So I think it's seeking every opportunity to hear those voices, and even those more reluctant voices, to encourage them to have one, to make sure they are fully engaged in society, to become the kind of adults that we need for society to thrive.
I think that is the perfect way to end today's webinar. I just want to say a very big thank you to everyone who has joined us today. I know we had lots of partners and people from across the sector, and I do think, you know, as we said at the very beginning, actually all of those voices, all of those perspectives, whether it's you know, really tapping into youth campaigning, our partners at Bike Back 2030, for instance, are brilliant in that space, or whether it's about engaging with you know, practitioners in schools up and down the country, and different types of schools, as Julie touched on, all face different challenges, but also see different opportunities. And I think ultimately we can best learn from having those diverse voices in the room. And hopefully this morning gave us all a little bit of that. Thank you once more to all of the speakers, to Julie, Katie and Sabrina. And thank you very much to People's Postcode Lottery for supporting our research. For those of you who would like to keep reading and keep hearing about what thousands of parents, pupils and caregivers had to say about breakfast, please go onto our website, www.magicbreakfast.com, where our What's for Breakfast report has gone live. And please get in touch. As Katie said at the beginning, we would love to work with and to collaborate with others. And I think today's discussion has highlighted not just the scale of the challenges, but ultimately the scale of the opportunities that we've got if we do really purposefully and effectively work together. And I hope for the policymakers and decision makers who are on today's webinar, you bring these voices into the room where decisions are made, and they get to be part of that decision making and planning for the future as well. So thank you all so very much. Have a great rest of the day.